The story begins in the heart of a vibrant European city, alive with history and charm. Michael, a 30-year-old American tourist with an adventurous spirit, steps off the plane ready to soak up everything this iconic destination has to offer. With his camera slung around his neck and a backpack full of essentials, he dives headfirst into exploring cobblestone streets, ancient cathedrals, and bustling markets. But one sight on his itinerary stands out above the rest: a grand palace known for its breathtaking architecture and the ceremonial guards stationed outside. On the third day of his trip, Michael makes his way to the palace. It's early afternoon, and the sun shines brightly overhead, casting golden hues over the ornate building. Tourists from all over the world crowd around, snapping photos and marveling at the sight of the guards standing perfectly still in their striking uniforms. These soldiers are more than just protectors. They're symbols of national pride, representing centuries of tradition and honor. Their stoic presence commands respect, but Michael doesn't see it that way, at least not yet. Michael approaches the nearest guard, intrigued by how motionless the man is. He waves his hand in front of the guard's face, trying to get a reaction, but there's none. A few bystanders chuckle at Michael's antics, while others shake their heads disapprovingly. Still, Michael isn't deterred. He leans closer, joking loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Hey buddy, you part of a wax museum or something?" "Smile once for the tourists." His words fall flat, met only by silence from the guard and awkward glances from fellow visitors. Feeling ignored and slightly annoyed, Michael decides to push things further. Earlier that day, he'd picked up a small pocket knife as a souvenir from a street vendor. It wasn't anything special, just a basic blade meant for utility. But now it catches his eye. Without thinking through the consequences, Michael pulls it out and holds it up playfully, pretending to inspect the guard's uniform. "This fabric looks fancy," he says with a smirk. "Maybe I'll take a little piece home as a keepsake." Before anyone can react, Michael makes a quick slash across the sleeve of the guard's uniform. The sharp sound of tearing fabric cuts through the air like a shockwave. For a moment, time seems to freeze. Gasps ripple through the crowd as people realize what just happened. The guard stiffens but remains silent, adhering strictly to protocol. Panic sets in as security officers rush toward Michael, shouting orders and grabbing his arms. Cameras flash wildly as tourists capture the chaos unfolding before them. Within seconds, Michael is surrounded by authorities, his face pale with disbelief. What started as a misguided attempt at humor has spiraled into something far more serious. As they drag him away, he stammers apologies, claiming it was all a joke gone wrong. But no one is laughing now. The shredded uniform lies as a stark reminder of the cultural line Michael crossed, a line he didn't even know existed until it was too late. Little does he realize, this reckless act will set off a chain of events that will change his life forever. Michael's world turned upside down the moment he was shoved into a cold, dimly lit holding cell. The guards who had escorted him there didn't say a word, but their stern expressions spoke volumes. His mind raced as he replayed the events in his head. The joke, the knife, the slash, and then the chaos that followed. He couldn't believe how quickly everything spiraled out of control. Sitting on the hard bench, Michael buried his face in his hands, trying to make sense of what had happened. Was this really happening? How could something so small, a silly prank, land him in jail? Outside the police station, news of the incident spread like wildfire. Social media platforms lit up with videos taken by bystanders, capturing every second of Michael's reckless act. Within hours, hashtags about the American tourist trended not only locally but internationally. People were outraged. To many, the ceremonial guards weren't just ordinary soldiers. They represented centuries of history, tradition, and national pride. Their uniforms were sacred symbols, meticulously maintained and deeply respected. Cutting one wasn't just vandalism. It felt like an attack on the country's identity. Local news channels picked up the story, airing interviews with witnesses and experts who condemned Michael's actions. One journalist described it as a blatant disrespect for our culture, while another called it an insult to everything we hold dear. Online forums buzzed with heated debates. Some people labeled Michael a clueless idiot, while others branded him a disrespectful foreigner who deserved to be punished severely. Memes mocking him began circulating, turning the once carefree tourist into a laughingstock and a villain. Back in the United States, Michael's family gathered around their living room TV, horrified by what they saw. His mother clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face, while his father paced back and forth, muttering under his breath. "That's not my son," his mom whispered, shaking her head. "He wouldn't do something like this, would he?" They tried calling Michael repeatedly, but his phone had been confiscated during the arrest. Desperate for answers, they reached out to the U.S. Embassy, hoping someone could help them understand what was going on. Meanwhile, inside the cell, Michael struggled to process the magnitude of the situation. He'd always considered himself easygoing and fun-loving. Back home, his friends thought of him as the guy who could lighten any mood with a joke or two. But here, thousands of miles away from everything familiar, those same traits had landed him in serious trouble. For the first time in his life, Michael realized that humor doesn't always translate across cultures, and sometimes ignorance can have devastating consequences. As hours passed, Michael's lawyer arrived at the station. She introduced herself as Sarah, a sharp-witted attorney specializing in international cases. After listening to Michael's side of the story, she explained the gravity of the charges against him. Damaging a national symbol carried severe penalties, including hefty fines, possible imprisonment, and even deportation. "This isn't just about a uniform," Sarah said firmly. "It's about respect, or lack thereof, for an entire nation's heritage." Sarah's words hit Michael like a punch to the gut. He hadn't meant to offend anyone. In fact, he hadn't given much thought to the guard's role beyond seeing him as part of the scenery. Now, faced with the reality of his actions, guilt began to weigh heavily on him. As the night wore on, Michael stared at the cracked ceiling of his cell, wondering if he'd ever be able to fix the mess he'd made. Little did he know, the hardest battles were still ahead. The next morning, Michael was escorted to a small, sterile room where Sarah, his lawyer, waited with a stack of papers and a grave expression. She wasted no time diving into the details of his case, explaining that the slashed uniform wasn't just fabric, it symbolized centuries of tradition and sacrifice. "These guards are more than just soldiers," she said firmly. "They represent pride, honor, and history. What you did is being seen as an attack on all of that." Michael's stomach churned as he listened. He had never stopped to think about what the uniform meant. To him, it was just part of the tourist experience, a photo opportunity. But now, sitting across from Sarah, he began to understand why people were so angry. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this whole situation was spiraling out of proportion. "I didn't mean any harm," he insisted, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "It was supposed to be a stupid joke. I thought maybe the guy would laugh or something." Sarah nodded, though her expression remained serious. "I believe you, Michael. But intentions don't erase consequences. You're dealing with cultural sensitivities here, and people feel deeply disrespected." She went on to explain that public sentiment was overwhelmingly against him. Protesters had gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read things like "Respect our heritage" and "Foreigners must learn boundaries." Videos of the incident continued to circulate online, fueling outrage not just locally but globally. As the days passed, Michael spent most of his time in the holding cell reflecting on what Sarah had told him. He replayed the moment over and over in his mind. The way he pulled out the knife, the sharp sound of the fabric tearing, the shocked gasps of the crowd. It all seemed surreal now, like some bizarre nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He tried to imagine how he'd feel if someone came to America and disrespected something sacred to him, like the American flag. Would he be angry? Hurt? Probably both. The realization made him cringe. Maybe this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding after all. Sarah worked tirelessly to build a defense strategy centered around cultural ignorance. She argued that Michael's actions were reckless and inappropriate. Yes, but they weren't malicious. He was a foreigner unfamiliar with local customs, and while that didn't excuse his behavior, it provided context. During one of their meetings, she encouraged Michael to write a letter of apology, not just to the guardsmen, but to the entire nation. "People need to see that you regret what you did," she said. "A sincere apology might not fix everything, but it could go a long way." Michael took her advice to heart. Late at night, when the cell was quiet and the weight of his mistakes pressed heavily on him, he sat down with pen and paper. At first, the words came slowly, each sentence feeling inadequate. But as he wrote, his thoughts began to flow more freely. He apologized for his ignorance, acknowledged the significance of the uniform, and promised to educate himself about the country's culture and traditions. By the time he finished, tears blurred his vision. For the first time since his arrest, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he could begin to make amends. Despite these efforts, the road ahead looked daunting. Prosecutors were pushing for harsh penalties, arguing that leniency would send the wrong message. Public opinion remained divided, with some calling for forgiveness and others demanding justice. As Michael awaited his trial, he couldn't help but wonder, could he ever truly repair the damage he caused? Or was this mistake destined to follow him for the rest of his life? The courtroom was packed to the brim on the day of Michael's trial. Reporters with microphones and cameras jostled for position outside, while inside, every seat was taken. The air buzzed with tension as people whispered among themselves, eagerly anticipating what would unfold. Some had come to see justice served, while others were simply curious about the American tourist who had become an international headline. For Michael, walking into that room felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone was watching his every move and judging him for it. At the center of the chaos sat Michael, dressed in a borrowed suit that hung loosely on his frame. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched a notepad filled with scribbled notes and reminders from Sarah, his lawyer. She leaned close to him, speaking in hushed tones to calm his nerves. "Stay focused," she whispered. "Just tell the truth." But telling the truth wasn't going to be easy, not when so many people already believed they knew who he was. A reckless, disrespectful foreigner who thought he could mock their traditions without consequences. The prosecution wasted no time painting Michael as exactly that. Their opening statement was sharp and damning, portraying him as someone who deliberately disrespected national symbols for amusement. They called witness after witness, tourists who had been there that day, palace staff, even historians who spoke passionately about the significance of the ceremonial guards. One elderly historian described the uniforms as living pieces of history, painstakingly crafted and maintained to honor generations of service. When asked how he felt about the incident, his voice cracked with emotion. "It's heartbreaking," he said simply, shaking his head. "Heartbreaking." But the most powerful testimony came from the guardsman himself, the very man whose uniform Michael had slashed. Dressed in civilian clothes, he took the stand with quiet dignity. His eyes locked onto Michael's as he recounted the moment the knife cut through the fabric. "I didn't move because I am trained not to react," he explained, his tone steady but laced with pain. "But inside, I felt insulted, disrespected. That uniform represents my duty, my family's legacy, and my country's pride. It is not something to be treated lightly." Michael couldn't look away. Hearing the guardsman speak stirred emotions he hadn't fully processed before. Shame, guilt, regret. He wanted to say something, anything, to make it right. But he knew now wasn't the time. Instead, he listened intently, forcing himself to face the weight of what he'd done. When it was finally Michael's turn to take the stand, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him as he nervously adjusted the microphone in front of him. With Sarah's guidance, he began by apologizing, not just to the court, but to the guardsmen and everyone affected by his actions. "I never intended to hurt anyone or disrespect your culture," he said, his voice trembling. "I was careless, ignorant, and selfish. I see now how wrong I was, and I will carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life." His words seemed to resonate with some in the room, particularly those who had entered the courtroom undecided about whether Michael deserved punishment or compassion. Others remained unmoved, their arms crossed tightly as they stared at him with skepticism. Outside, the debate raged on. Social media exploded with reactions to the trial, with hashtags like #JusticeForThegard and #ForgiveAndTeach trending side by side. Opinions clashed fiercely, reflecting the divide between those who saw Michael as irredeemable and those who believed everyone deserved a second chance. As the day wore on, it became clear that this case was about more than one man's mistake. It had sparked a larger conversation about cultural understanding, accountability, and forgiveness. And though Michael couldn't predict the outcome of his trial, he realized something important. Whatever happened next, he owed it to himself and to everyone watching to prove that he had truly changed. As the trial progressed, Michael found himself at a crossroads. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened, but he also understood that simply saying, "I'm sorry," wasn't enough. If he wanted any chance of redemption, he needed to take action, real, meaningful steps to show he was serious about making amends. With Sarah's guidance, he began drafting plans for how he could demonstrate his remorse and commitment to learning from his mistakes. One of the first things Michael did was agree to participate in a court-mandated mediation session with the guardsman whose uniform he had damaged. The idea made him nervous. He didn't know how the guardsman would react or if he'd even be willing to meet with him. But to Michael's surprise and relief, the guardsman agreed. On the day of the meeting, they sat across from each other in a quiet room, separated by a small table. At first, the atmosphere was tense, with long pauses between words. Michael struggled to find the right thing to say, fearing anything he offered might sound insincere. "I want you to know I never meant to disrespect you or your uniform," Michael finally said, his voice soft but steady. "I was thoughtless and selfish, and I deeply regret what I did. I hope one day you can forgive me." The guardsman listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but firm. "Your actions hurt not just me, but my family and my country," he said. "That uniform represents something bigger than me. It's a symbol of everything we stand for. What you did felt like an attack on all of that." Michael nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand now why it mattered so much," he replied. "And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I never make a mistake like this again." To Michael's astonishment, the guardsman softened slightly. "I believe you're sorry," he admitted after a pause. "But apologies aren't enough. You need to show people that you've learned from this, that you respect our culture and traditions." Those words stuck with Michael long after the session ended. They became the driving force behind his next steps. With Sarah's help, he arranged to volunteer at local cultural centers, assisting with programs designed to educate tourists about the importance of respecting local customs. He also recorded a heartfelt public service announcement, addressing viewers directly. In the video, he recounted his story, acknowledging his ignorance and urging others to approach new cultures with humility and care. "Don't let curiosity turn into carelessness," he warned. "Take the time to learn before you act." Back in jail awaiting sentencing, Michael threw himself into these efforts with determination. He read books about the country's history, attended lectures organized by the prison chaplain, and wrote letters to schools back home, offering to share his experience as a cautionary tale. Slowly but surely, his reputation began to shift. While many still viewed him harshly, others started to see glimpses of sincerity in his actions. News outlets reported on his community service projects, highlighting his attempts to turn his mistake into a lesson for others. Even so, Michael knew forgiveness wouldn't come easily or quickly. Every night, as he lay on the thin mattress in his cell, He replayed the guardsman's words in his mind. Apologies aren't enough. It was a reminder that earning trust takes time, effort, and consistency. And though the weight of his guilt often kept him awake, it also pushed him forward. For the first time in his life, Michael realized that growth came not from avoiding mistakes, but from facing them head-on, and doing everything possible to make things right. Despite the challenges ahead, Michael felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild some of what he had broken. But he knew the journey wouldn't end when the trial did. It was only beginning. The mediation session between Michael and the guardsman marked a turning point in the case, a moment that would later be described as unexpected yet profoundly human. Neither man walked into the room expecting much. Michael, still grappling with shame and regret, braced himself for anger or outright rejection. The guardsman, on the other hand, carried the weight of his own emotions: hurt, frustration, and perhaps even a glimmer of curiosity about the stranger who had caused such uproar. They sat across from each other at a small wooden table, the air thick with unspoken tension. For several minutes, neither spoke. Michael fidgeted with his hands, unsure where to begin, while the guardsman studied him quietly, his expression unreadable. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "I don't know if you'll believe me," he started, his voice shaky but sincere, "but I truly never meant to disrespect you or your uniform. I see now how wrong I was, and I'll carry that lesson with me forever." The guardsman listened without interrupting, his gaze steady. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't mince words. "What you did hurt more than just me," he said firmly. "It felt like an insult to everything my uniform stands for, to generations of service and sacrifice. My family has served in this role for decades. That uniform is part of who we are." Michael nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "I understand now," he replied, "and I'll do whatever it takes to make amends. I want to learn. I want to show people that I've changed." For the first time, the guardsman's stern demeanor softened slightly. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "It's not easy to forgive something like this," he admitted, "but I can see that you're sorry. And maybe forgiveness is part of moving forward, for both of us." Those words hit Michael like a wave, washing over him with a mix of relief and gratitude. He hadn't expected compassion, especially not from someone he had wronged so deeply. But the guardsman's willingness to consider forgiveness, even hesitantly, sparked a new sense of hope within him. Outside the mediation room, reactions were mixed. News of the guardsman's openness to reconciliation quickly spread, sparking heated debates online and in the media. Some praised him for his maturity and grace, calling it a powerful example of humanity triumphing over anger. Others accused him of being too lenient, arguing that Michael's actions deserved no mercy. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse once again, holding signs that ranged from "forgiveness is strength" to "no excuses for disrespect." The divide in public opinion only grew wider. Despite the backlash, the guardsman stood by his decision. In a brief statement released through his lawyer, he explained that while he couldn't erase the pain Michael had caused, he believed in giving people a chance to grow. "We all make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what we do after them." If Michael is truly committed to learning and changing, then perhaps there's value in allowing him that opportunity. Back in custody, Michael reflected on the guard's accountability. The day of sentencing arrived, and the courtroom was packed once again. This time, however, there was a different energy in the air, an undercurrent of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, cameras ready to capture every reaction. Outside, crowds gathered, holding signs that reflected the ongoing divide. Some demanded justice, while others called for leniency. Michael sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly together, his heart pounding like a drum. He knew this moment would define not just his immediate future, but how he would be remembered long after the trial ended. When the judge entered the room, a hush fell over the crowd. After a brief pause, the judge began speaking, addressing both Michael and the gallery. This case has sparked widespread debate about cultural respect, accountability, and forgiveness. The judge said, his voice calm but authoritative. It is clear that Mr. Michael acted recklessly, without regard for the significance of the uniform or the traditions it represents. However, it is also evident that he has expressed genuine remorse and taken steps to make amends. Michael listened intently, his eyes fixed on the judge. The words were measured, neither harsh nor overly sympathetic, but they carried immense weight. The judge acknowledged the guardsman's dignity during the mediation session and praised his willingness to extend forgiveness, a gesture that had resonated deeply with many people. At the same time, the judge emphasized that Michael's actions could not go unpunished. Respect for cultural symbols is non-negotiable, he continued. Ignoring this principle undermines mutual understanding between nations and communities. Finally, the verdict came. Michael was sentenced to 6 months of house arrest, followed by mandatory participation in cultural education programs aimed at teaching foreign visitors about local customs and heritage. Additionally, he was fined a substantial amount, money that would go toward preserving historical artifacts related to the ceremonial guards. Perhaps most notably, Michael was required to record a public service announcement, PSA, warning travelers about the importance of respecting local laws and traditions. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the proceedings, Michael exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of emotions. Relief washed over him. He wouldn't be going to prison, but it was tempered by the knowledge that his life had been forever changed. The sentence wasn't just punishment. It was an opportunity to prove himself, to show the world that he had truly learned from his mistakes. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted as reporters swarmed around Michael and his lawyer. Flashbulbs popped, microphones were thrust toward him, and questions flew from all directions. "Do you think the sentence fits your crime?" one reporter shouted. Another asked, "How do you plan to rebuild trust with the public?" For a moment, Michael hesitated, overwhelmed by the noise and attention. But then he stepped forward, gripping the edges of the podium set up for statements. "I want to start by saying thank you to the court for its decision today," Michael began, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside him. "I know I made a terrible mistake, one that hurt people and disrespected an entire nation's pride. There's no excuse for what I did, and I accept full responsibility for my actions." He paused, looking directly into the cameras, to the guardsmen whose uniform I damaged, and to everyone affected by my behavior. "I am truly sorry. I hope my efforts moving forward will show that I'm committed to making things right." His statement was met with mixed reactions. Some nodded approvingly, acknowledging his sincerity, while others remained skeptical, convinced that apologies couldn't undo the harm he'd caused. Social media exploded with commentary, dissecting every word of his speech. Yet amidst the noise, one thing was undeniable. Michael's journey was far from over. His apology may have marked the end of the trial, but it was only the beginning of his path toward redemption. As he walked away from the courthouse, flanked by security to shield him from the crowd, Michael felt the weight of what lay ahead. House arrest, community service, financial penalties, all of it paled in comparison to the personal growth he needed to achieve. But for the first time since his arrest, he felt a flicker of optimism. He didn't know if he'd ever fully earn forgiveness, but he was determined to try. Months later, Michael returned to the United States, a changed man. The house arrest had been challenging, confined to a small apartment with limited freedom. He spent hours reflecting on his actions and the ripple effect they'd caused. But it was during this time that he truly began to understand the gravity of his mistake. He read books about cultural sensitivity, watched documentaries on global traditions, and even started journaling his thoughts. Each day brought new realizations, and though the guilt still lingered, he found solace in knowing he was actively working to become better. Once his sentence ended, Michael didn't stop there. Determined to turn his experience into something positive, he began speaking publicly about what he'd learned. At first, it was just small gatherings, local schools, community centers, and Rotary Club meetings, but word of his story spread quickly. People were intrigued by his honesty and willingness to confront his past. Soon, invitations poured in from larger venues, including universities and international travel forums. Standing before audiences, Michael recounted every detail of his journey: the reckless act, the trial, the guardsman's unexpected forgiveness, and his ongoing efforts to educate others. "I made a huge mistake," he often said, looking directly at the crowd. "But I'm using it as a lesson, not just for myself, but for anyone who travels or interacts with cultures different from their own." His talk struck a chord with listeners. Many approached him afterward, thanking him for sharing his story. Some confessed they had made similar blunders while traveling, unaware of how their actions could offend locals. Others admitted they had judged Michael harshly when the incident first broke, but now saw him in a new light, as someone brave enough to admit fault and work toward change. These conversations gave Michael hope, reminding him that growth was possible, even after the worst mistakes. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the guardsman continued to receive praise for his role in fostering reconciliation, his decision to participate in the mediation session, and his eventual show of forgiveness had touched countless lives. In interviews, he emphasized the importance of empathy and understanding, urging people not to let anger overshadow humanity. "We all have the capacity to forgive," he said in one televised appearance. "And sometimes forgiveness opens doors we didn't even know were closed." Though he and Michael hadn't stayed in regular contact, the two men occasionally exchanged messages, checking in on each other's progress. Their unlikely connection became a symbol of healing and mutual respect across borders. As months turned into years, Michael's life took on a new purpose. He partnered with organizations focused on promoting cultural awareness among travelers, helping create educational materials distributed worldwide. He also launched a podcast where he interviewed experts, historians, and everyday people about the beauty and challenges of cross-cultural interactions. Through these efforts, he hoped to prevent others from repeating his mistakes. Despite his achievements, Michael never forgot the lessons he'd learned. Every time he traveled, he approached new places with humility and care, taking the time to research local customs before arriving. And whenever he saw ceremonial guards or national symbols, he felt a pang of remembrance, a quiet reminder of the moment that had changed everything. The story eventually faded from headlines, but its impact endured. Tourists began paying closer attention to cultural norms, inspired by Michael's cautionary tale. Teachers used his case studies in classrooms to spark discussions about respect and responsibility. Even the guardsman's uniform, carefully repaired after the incident, became a symbol of resilience and unity, a testament to the idea that even broken things can be mended with effort and goodwill. In the end, Michael's journey wasn't just about redemption, it was about transformation. What started as a reckless act evolved into a powerful message about learning, accountability, and the enduring power of forgiveness. And those scars remained, both visible and invisible. They served as reminders of how far he'd come and the bridges he'd helped rebuild along the way.